What if the Nationalists won the Chinese Civil War? Picture this for a moment. What if I told you that one single river crossing could have changed the entire course of world history? What if Chairman Mao never ruled China? What if Taiwan wasn't the refuge of the defeated, but rather the birthplace of a victory that reshaped Asia forever? Right. I know what you're thinking. That's impossible, mate. Mao won, didn't he? Well, buckle up, because today we're diving into one of history's most fascinating alternative We're exploring a world where the dice rolled differently, where the Yangtze River became not a communist highway to victory, but a nationalist fortress that held firm against all odds. Now, before we crack on with this absolutely mental story, let me paint you a picture of where it all began. Wuhan, a city that once stood as the very heartbeat of revolution in China. This wasn't just any old industrial town, right? This was the place where empires fell and dreams were born. When the Qing dynasty crumbled like a biscuit dunked too long in tea, Wuhan was there at the center of it all. When Japanese forces steamrolled across China like they owned the place, Wuhan became the symbol of defiance, the rallying cry that echoed across a nation that refused to bow down. But by the time our story properly kicks off, all you could hear in those ancient streets were the heavy footsteps of two very different armies. On one side, the jackboots of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces. On the other, the determined march of Mao's communist revolutionaries. And between them, the mighty Yangtze River, flowing like a liquid border between two completely incompatible visions of what China should become. Think about it for a second. This river, which had been China's commercial lifeline for centuries, carrying goods and people across the vast expanse of the Middle Kingdom, had now become a battlefield. Mines bobbed in its murky waters like deadly water lilies. Patrol boats prowled its surface like mechanical sharks. What was once a highway of prosperity had transformed into a barrier of war. The thing is, both sides knew that whoever controlled the Yangtze would likely control China's future. And that's where our alternative timeline begins to take shape. Because in our world, things went very differently indeed. Now, I need to give you some context here, because this story doesn't start in a vacuum. Picture the scene. It's August 27th, 1945. Japan has just surrendered, and two men who absolutely despised each other are forced to raise a toast together. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist forces, and Mao Zedong, chairman of the Communist Party, clinking glasses like old mates, whilst secretly planning each other's destruction. The Americans were desperately trying to play peacemaker, bringing these two bitter rivals together in the hope of creating a unified, democratic China. But anyone with half a brain could see it was all for show. Both sides were smiling across the negotiating table, whilst simultaneously stockpiling weapons and preparing for the bloodbath they all knew was coming. And here's the mad bit. The talks actually happened. In Chongqing and Nanjing, diplomats shuffled papers and made grand speeches about peace and unity. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, both armies were recruiting, training, and positioning themselves for what everyone knew would be the real decider. All-out civil war. But here's where our alternative timeline starts to diverge from what actually happened. You see, the communists in our real world were brilliant at playing the long game. They used every minute of those fake peace talks to reorganize, to win over the peasants, to position themselves strategically. The nationalists, well, they were a bit of a shambles, to be perfectly honest. The Kuomintang, despite looking mighty impressive on paper, was absolutely riddled with problems. Corruption ran through the party like rot through old timber. The leadership was incompetent, making decision after decision that pushed ordinary Chinese people straight into the welcoming arms of the Communist Party. Was like watching someone repeatedly shoot themselves in the foot whilst complaining about the pain. Take their treatment of collaborators. For instance, after Japan surrendered, there were thousands of Chinese who had worked with Wang Jingwei's puppet government. Now, some of these people were proper traitors who deserved what was coming to them, but many others had simply been trying to survive under occupation, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. The nationalists treated them all with brutal suspicion, often executing or imprisoning people who might have been valuable allies. Meanwhile, the communists were clever. They welcomed these people with open arms, offering forgiveness and a fresh start. It was brilliant propaganda. Really? Look, they could say, the nationalists want to punish you for surviving. We want to help you build a new China. But the real game changer was happening up north in Manchuria. This region was absolutely crucial. It was China's industrial heartland, packed with factories, mines, and resources that both sides desperately needed. And here's where things get really interesting, because the Soviets were pulling some proper shenanigans. Stalin's boys had moved into Manchuria as part of their war against Japan, and they weren't in any hurry to leave. They'd captured absolutely massive stockpiles of Japanese weapons, tanks, artillery, rifles, ammunition, the whole lot. And guess where most of those weapons ended up? Straight into the hands of Mao's forces. Meanwhile, the Americans were in a right pickle. They could see what was happening, but they were war-weary and reluctant to get dragged into another major conflict. General Albert Wedemeyer, who was acting as chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek, was practically begging Washington to send 7 American divisions to oversee the Japanese surrender and keep the Soviets in check. But the political will just wasn't there. President Harry Truman was watching all this unfold with growing alarm. The man had just dealt with ending World War II, and now he was faced with the prospect of losing China to communism. So he authorized something called Operation Magic, a comprehensive program to restructure the nationalist military machine. Enter General Robert McClure, a psychological warfare specialist who was tasked with turning the Kuomintang forces into a proper fighting force. Now, McClure was no mug. He understood that you couldn't win a modern war with a corrupt, demoralized army. So he set about dealing with the worst aspects of nationalist incompetence. New operating procedures were established. Merit began to play a bigger role in promotions. Competent generals like Li Zongren started getting the positions and resources they needed to actually fight effectively. For a moment, it looked like the nationalists might actually get their act together. But here's the thing about Chiang Kai-shek. He was his own worst enemy. Against all advice from his American advisors, he decided to launch a massive offensive against communist positions in northern China. It was like watching someone ignore their sat-nav and drive straight into a swamp. General Wei Li Huang hurled over 100 brigades against communist strongholds in what should have been an overwhelming assault. On paper, it looked brilliant. In reality, it played right into Mao's hands. You see, the communist strategy was absolutely genius in its simplicity. They wouldn't fight unless they were certain to win. If the nationalists came at them with superior force, they'd simply melt away, ceding territory but preserving their army. Then, when the nationalists were overextended and exhausted, they'd strike back. It was like trying to fight smoke. The nationalists would capture a town or a region, plant their flag, and declare victory. But holding on to these gains required massive resources and manpower. Meanwhile, the communist guerrillas would be harassing their supply lines. picking off isolated units, and generally making life absolutely miserable for the occupying forces. The psychological impact was devastating. Every time the nationalists took a communist stronghold, the local population would see them as occupiers rather than liberators. The communists, meanwhile, positioned themselves as the plucky underdogs fighting against oppression. There were some symbolic victories for the nationalists, like capturing the former communist headquarters at Yan'an 1947. But these were Pyrrhic victories that cost more than they were worth. Within a year, the People's Liberation Army had inflicted irreplaceable losses on nationalist forces. Over 1 million troops were killed, wounded, or had defected to Mao's side. And here's where Mao showed his political genius. In the areas under communist control, he implemented immediate land reform. Now, you have to understand what this meant to Chinese peasants. For centuries, they'd been working land owned by wealthy landlords, barely scraping together enough to survive. Suddenly, the communists were saying, "This land, it's yours. Now, farm it, keep the profits, build a better life for your family." It was revolutionary in the most literal sense. As Mao himself put it, "The people are the sea, and the soldiers are the fish. Without water, the fish cannot survive." By winning over the peasants, the communists ensured they'd always have support, supplies, and recruits. Meanwhile, the nationalists were still struggling with the same old problems. George Marshall, who had been sent as a special envoy to try and sort out the mess, attempted to pressure the Kuomintang into serious reforms by withholding American aid. But Chiang resisted every attempt to loosen his grip on power, which meant the nationalists were deprived of the very assistance they desperately needed. It was like watching a drowning man refuse a life preserver because he didn't like the color. The internal strife within the Nationalist Party was getting worse by the day, with different factions more interested in fighting each other than fighting the General Wedemeyer could see the writing on the wall. In his reports back to Washington, he warned that a communist-dominated China was becoming increasingly likely. He urged immediate assistance with munitions, technical support, and tactical advice if the nationalists were to have any chance of survival. But Mao was also worried about international intervention. He knew that a UN-enforced ceasefire could deny him control of the crucial northeastern regions. So he ordered General Lin Bao's Northeast Field Army to go on the offensive before any international peacekeepers could arrive. The resulting battles in Manchuria were absolutely brutal. Although the nationalist troops initially inflicted heavy losses, the repeated hammer blows from General Lin's forces proved too much to withstand. By the Fifth Communist Offensive, nationalist positions in Manchuria had been cut off from the mainland. It was a disaster in the making. The nationalists faced a choice: fight to the death in isolated pockets, or attempt a dangerous breakout. They chose the latter, and through sheer determination and no small amount of luck, they managed to extract most of their forces. But the retreat was costly, both in terms of casualties and morale. Now, the communists controlled not just the northeast, but much of the Shandong Peninsula as well. Generals Li Zongren and Ba Chongxi, two of the more competent nationalist commanders, urged Chiang to fall back and establish a defensive line along the Yangtze River. It was sound military thinking, but it meant abandoning vast swaths of northern China. The battle for central China was about to begin, and it would determine the fate of the world's most populous nation. Bai, who was leading the nationalist defense, found himself facing two entire communist field armies, supported by hundreds of thousands of peasant militiamen. Day and night, the fighting raged across the plains. Communist guerrillas harassed nationalist positions, cutting supply lines and communications. But here's where those American reforms started to pay off. The nationalist units were more disciplined now, better organized, and crucially, they had air support. The Nationalist Air Force flew countless sorties, bombing communist positions and providing crucial intelligence. It was like having eyes in the sky, allowing the defenders to anticipate attacks and coordinate their responses. But the communist offensive was relentless. General Chung Yi, 3rd Field Army, launched what military historians call a human wave attack. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers charging across open ground, accepting massive casualties to overwhelm the defenders. It nearly worked. The attack tore a massive gap in the nationalist lines, encircling the main forces of the 7th Army east of Shu. For a moment, it looked like the game was up. The surrounded troops were cut off, running low on supplies and facing annihilation. But reinforcements from the southeast managed to break the siege after 11 days of the most vicious fighting imaginable. Both armies were severely mauled in the process, and Suzhou was nearly surrounded. Recognizing the futility of holding the Central Plains against such overwhelming numbers, Bai ordered a strategic withdrawal toward the WWII River, and then toward the nationalist capital of Nan. The defeat at WWII shattered morale within nationalist ranks, as Beijing and its surrounding provinces fell to communist forces. The war's brutal toll left soldiers exhausted and commanders desperately searching for answers. Secretly, Chiang began preparing to make Taiwan a final fortified redoubt against the Communist. But publicly, he was determined to make a stand at the Yangtze River. After all, thanks to Bai Chongxi's tactical brilliance, the nationalists had emerged from the Central Plains, battered but still breathing. And this is where our alternative timeline really begins to diverge from recorded history. You see, in the real world, the nationalists were so demoralized and disorganized by this point that they could unmount an effective defense of the Yang. But in our timeline, something very different was about to happen. While the nationalists were preparing their defenses south of the Yangtze, cracks were beginning to show in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communists. Stalin was becoming increasingly worried about American assistance to the nationalists, as well as the communists' failure to deliver that final, crushing blow that would end the war once and for all. As a result, he repeatedly urged Mao not to cross the Yangtze River. Stalin's thinking was purely strategic. He feared that American intervention might become more likely if the communists appeared to be on the verge of total victory. Better, he thought, to consolidate control of northern China and negotiate from a position of strength. But Mao was absolutely furious with this suggestion. The chairman had not come this far to settle for half a country. He wasn't willing to turn China into a northern and southern dynasty, divided like Korea or Vietnam would later become. In his mind, revolution meant total victory, not compromise. So, on the night of April 21st, 1949, Mao and his communist forces set out to cross the great Yangtze River, determined to finish what they'd started. But the nationalists were ready for them. With their superior navy, air force, and over 700,000 men, Li Zongren had turned the southern bank into a fortress that was virtually impervious to frontal assault. When the first communist units boarded their junks and attempted to cross, they came under withering fire from the nationalist fortress at Jiangyan and the Chinese navy. The crossing turned into an absolute bloodbath. Communist casualties piled up rapidly as boat after boat was sunk or driven back. The battle escalated into a major international crisis when 4 British warships found themselves under bombardment by communist artillery. The communists insisted they had the right of passage across the river, whilst the British demanded safe conduct for their vessels. This event, which became known as the Amethyst incident caused the United Kingdom, France, and the United States to threaten direct intervention against the communist forces. Stalin, desperate to prevent an international war that could drag the Soviet Union into direct confrontation with the West, put his military forces in the Far East on full combat readiness. It was a proper Mexican standoff. If you'll pardon the expression, Mao's forces couldn't cross into southern China, but the Americans and Soviets appeared to be mere inches from all-out war. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. True conflict was only avoided by some frantic behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The American and Soviet ambassadors to China managed to hammer out an agreement in the fighting in China would cease along the Yangtze River. The communists would control the northern part of the country, while the nationalists would control the southern part. In return, the United States would recognize the Soviet Union's special privileges in Manchuria. Unable to challenge the political will of their respective benefactors, Mao and Chiang reluctantly accepted this division. But tensions between the Republic in the south and the People's Republic in the north remained scant, although a nominal peace prevailed. The Chinese people found themselves caught between the excesses of both governments. In the North, Mao's relentless land reform movement and campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries led to the deaths and arrests of millions. Meanwhile, Chiang's White Terror had similar effects in the south. Authoritarianism on both sides triggered widespread unrest. Communist agitators took to the streets of Shanghai and Guangzhou, whilst in the People's Republic, the Communist Party had to deal with a vicious Islamic insurgency under the leadership of Mao. But this is just the beginning of our story, isn't it? Because what we've established here is a world where China remains divided, where the Cold War takes on an entirely different character, and where the balance of power in Asia hangs by a thread. Now, I need to take you back a bit, because there's another version of events that's even more fascinating. What if things had gone differently right from the start? What if the nationalists had been more competent, more organized, more willing to embrace the reforms that could have saved them? As Emperor Hirohito's radio announcement crackled across Japan on August 15, 1945, declaring that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong knew that a race for influence had begun. Only 11 days after that broadcast, before any formal surrender ceremony had even taken place, communist guerrillas launched bold offensives, attempting to seize control of Shanghai, Wuhan, and Tianjin. Stalin had warned Mao against moving too early. The Communist Party simply did untab the forces to match the Kuomintang, and taking the blame for initiating a civil war was political suicide. But Mao was determined. In his mind, Stalin's conservatism was preventing the Communist Party from achieving true revolution. So explosions rocked China's eastern seaboard as communist forces launched their premature offensive. The defenders, many of them former soldiers loyal to Wang Jingwei's puppet regime, mounted fierce resistance as Chiang rushed his troops across the former territory of the collaborationist government. Although Mao scored some minor victories, like in the Baoyin region, setbacks in the larger urban centers were far more significant. The communists simply couldn't break through the defenders before the nationalists, with considerable American logistical support, reinforced their positions. By September 9th, when Japanese General Okamura formally surrendered to Chiang's deputy in the auditorium of the Central Military Academy in Nanjing, two things were undeniable. A full-scale resumption of the Chinese Civil War had begun, and the communists were clearly to blame. For President Truman, this chaos demanded immediate action. He dispatched George Marshall to determine how to achieve a unified democratic China. Marshall initially believed that a ceasefire and restored united front could accomplish this goal. But with the communist August offensives having already ruined any chance of peace and reconciliation, he concluded that a united China with the communists was simply unrealistic. Many Americans feared that direct U.S. intervention would provoke Soviet involvement, potentially triggering World War III. Nonetheless, to aid the nationalists, Truman significantly ramped up support for the Kuomintang. Military aid and advisors permeated the nationalist government and command structure. Marshall reluctantly became Chiang's primary advisor, and at his insistence, the Kuomintang slowly implemented crucial fiscal, political, and anti-corruption reforms. The relationship between the two men was troubled from the start. Marshall saw Chiang as a stubborn autocrat, whilst Chiang was haunted by his fierce rivalry with General Joseph Stalin, whom Marshall had strongly supported during the war against Japan. When Marshall was promoted to serve as Secretary of State in January 1947, Albert Wedemeyer replaced him as Chiang's personal advisor. The two men had a far better relationship. Wedemeyer's deep anti-communist convictions, as well as his successes against Japan in the Pacific War, earned him Chiang's trust in a way that Marshall never could. With Wedemeyer's help, Chiang went much further with his reforms. The April 1947 government reorganization purged many of the most corrupt and reactionary elements in Nanjing. By November, a new constitutional government was formed, guided by American advisors and investments. The economy slowly but surely began to recover. All across nationalist-held China, inflation decreased and the reconstruction of communications, mines, and industries provided much-needed economic revenue. Schools, newspapers, and public welfare activities reopened. Chiang even publicly initiated the first careful steps toward land reform, though these moves were far more cautious than Mao's radical redistribution program. While Kuomintang political reforms progressed slowly, military reorganization under U.S. guidance paid immediate dividends. In March 1947, Communist headquarters at Yan'an fell to nationalist forces. The situation in Manchuria remained precarious, but the nationalists were eager to seize the initiative. In May 1947, they launched a powerful attack between Qingdao and Jinan. Though the communists resisted fiercely, they were forced to temporarily abandon the area to nationalist armies under Bai Chongxi. Despite Mao's land reform popularity and effective propaganda, the communists lacked sufficient support to resist concentrated nationalist assaults. Their popularity was being undermined by the Kuomintang's own reforms and lingering public blame for plunging China into chaos in 1945. Though far from defeated in Manchuria, the communists were rapidly losing momentum in a war where defeat tends to engender more defeat. There had been few major communist victories, and the Kuomintang's reform agenda was undermining the Communist Party's revolutionary platform. Eager to reclaim momentum, the People's Liberation Army seized the offensive in the autumn of 1947. Using tanks and artillery largely supplied by the Soviets, Mao's forces managed to sever the critical railway west of Shenyang and isolate major nationalist garrisons. With some of their best forces cut off, the nationalist government faced a crucial decision: order a breakout or resort to an airlift. Both options were risky, but the government chose the airlift, even though it relied almost entirely on American forces to resupply nationalist strongholds. The sieges of Changchun, Gil, and Shenyang saw some of the bloodiest combat of the entire Civil War. Fierce house-to-house fighting reminded many nationalists veterans of the brutal defense of Shanghai a decade earlier. Communist artillery thundered overhead, whilst Kuomintang warplanes flew sortie after sortie to assist the defenders and guarantee supplies. The situation was precarious, and the winter freeze only added to the miserable conditions for both sides. But Mao didn't get the decisive victory he desperately needed. With tactical momentum in Manchuria stalling, the communists decided on a dangerous gambit. Mao shifted focus to the southwest, where communist forces steadily gained ground near the Shandong Peninsula and surrounding provinces. If they could overwhelm nationalist defenses here, it would consolidate communist control north of the Yang, cut off Beijing, and make continued air support to the besieged Manchurian cities impossible. In March 1948, communist forces struck with overwhelming force, launching wave after wave against nationalist strongholds across the northern plains. But something unexpected happened. The continued defense of the three besieged cities had provided enormous propaganda boosts for the nationalists, invigorating their morale in ways that nobody had anticipated. So when waves of guerrilla fighters barreled down on defenders near the High River in Beijing, the nationalist troops were motivated to stand firm in a way they hadn't been for years. Mao's forces battered nationalist positions around Suzhou, but Chiang's men simply would not budge. Once again, Kuomintang air superiority proved crucial. In one particularly dramatic incident, a flanking maneuver by General Chun Yi was spotted by aerial reconnaissance just in time, enabling the Nationalist Second Army to deliver a crushing An entire communist army, 170,000 strong, was annihilated. Chun Yi himself was killed in the fighting. It was a disaster for the communist forces, and it marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in the war's momentum. With Chun Yi's defeat, the Kuomintang launched a full-scale counteroffensive. The communist lines were in complete disarray as they struggled to find any coherent response. With support from Wang Wei's 12th Army advancing from the west, nationalist forces swept through the plains, seizing vast territories across Hunan and Shandong. As nationalist reinforcements arrived in force to support Beijing and Tianjin's defense, Mao finally realized the precariousness of his position. He ordered a strategic retreat behind the Great Wall east of the capital, hoping to turn the momentum in the more defensible mountain terrain. But the nationalists advanced far faster than anyone had expected. Communist commanders had predicted it would take weeks for Chiang's forces to reach the Great Wall. Instead, they arrived in just 20 days, catching the communist forces completely off guard. The nationalists advanced steadily along the inner coast of the Bahai Sea, retaking all the strong points along the Tianjin-Jinyang Railway that the communists had captured the previous year. Without adequate time to prepare a coordinated defense, communist forces were pushed back repeatedly by the relentless firepower of the Kuomintang's newly revitalized army. Simultaneously, a large nationalist force reinforced by the Beijing garrison moved northwest in an attempt to seize the crucial logistics hub of Chiang. Although the harsh mountainous terrain should have favored the communist defenders, concentrated aerial bombardment softened their defenses enough for nationalist troops to penetrate the city's southwestern approaches. Communist forces scrambled desperately to contain the breach, but the military superiority of US-trained and supplied Kuomintang units was simply too overwhelming. Entire divisions began switching sides to the nationalists, either through political opportunism or genuine belief that the tide of war had turned. Any attempt by the People's Liberation Army to restore stable front lines at the Great Wall was now jeopardized by these mass defections. The southern thrusts of the nationalist advance moved less rapidly, as entrenched communist forces made them pay dearly in blood for every meter of ground gained. But Chiang, now convinced that decisive victory was within his grasp, ordered his armies to continue their relentless advance. With the communists failing to retain control of Shenyang, Mao no longer had unlimited reinforcement options. Here, finally, was an opportunity to encircle and destroy the communist forces once and for all. In July 1948, the nationalist armies engaged the people Liberation Army in what would prove to be the crucial battle of the entire war, the Battle of Shanhaiguan, where the Great Wall of China meets the sea. The communists were entrenched and numerous, and initially, Chiang's impatience cost his forces dearly. Nationalist armies suffered staggering casualties in their attempts to break through the communist defensive lines. Repeated aerial attacks and naval bombardments sought to dislodge the defenders, but every concentrated assault was thrown back with heavy losses. For a moment, it seemed as though overwhelming the communist positions might be impossible. The Great Wall itself provided natural defensive advantages that even modern military technology struggled to overcome. But whilst Chiang's main force was locked in bitter combat at the pass, the Nationalists' 7th Army under Huang Batao executed a brilliant flanking maneuver. Breaking through communist lines near Linyu, they raced toward the coast near Qin as the White Sun banner of the Republic of China was raised at the local railway station. The communist forces suddenly found themselves caught in a devastating pincer movement. With nowhere to retreat, nationalist armies closed in on Shanhaiguan from both landward and seaward sides. Encircled and overwhelmed, over 500,000 communist troops were captured or killed. Hundreds of thousands more defected to the nationalist cause, whilst senior communist leaders, including Lin Biao and Deng Xiaoping, fell into nationalist hands. Mao's defeat was complete and catastrophic. Within days, the White Sun banner adorned the top of Tiananmen Gate in Beijing. Below, thousands of people gathered to witness Chiang Kai-shek deliver a victory speech that would echo through history. With his high-ranking military advisors and generals beside him, the Generalissimo declared the end of the Civil War and the complete victory of the armed forces of the Republic of China. The military parade of the anti-communist armies that followed made it clear to all who watched that the Kuomintang had, against all odds, asserted itself as the ruling force in the Middle Kingdom. Congratulatory telegrams poured in from around the world, with President Truman's message being particularly enthusiastic in tone. The crushing defeat at Shanhaiguan had shattered the military machine of the Chinese Communist Party completely. In a steady series of mopping up campaigns, reminiscent of Chiang's encirclement operations in the 1930s, nationalist forces systematically eliminated the remaining communist cells scattered throughout southern China, Shandong, and Manchuria. Those communist leaders fortunate enough to avoid capture or death, including Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, retreated into Mongolia under the protection of Joseph Stalin. From there, they continued to agitate against nationalist rule and launch occasional raids across the Manchurian frontier, but they were no longer a serious threat to Chiang's government. Although the 1947 Constitutional Convention had curbed some of the most excessive aspects of Kuomintang rule, the grip of the White Sun on the Republic's politics remained as tight as ever. Opposition parties were effectively banned, with Chiang repeatedly suppressing emerging political movements with accusations of communist subversion. Additionally, the Generalissimo set his sights on reincorporating the former territories of Xinjiang and Tibet, which he successfully annexed in 1949 and 1950, respectively. These campaigns were brutal affairs, involving the suppression of local independence movements and the forced integration of diverse ethnic populations into the Chinese Republic. By the mid-1960s, China under Kuomintang rule had once again sought its place as a major world power. While firmly anti-communist in its orientation, the Republic resisted full integration into the Western Bloc, preferring to maintain its independence from both superpower camps. This policy of strategic neutrality put China at odds with both the United States and the Soviet Union at various times. Relations with America remained superficially cordial, but tensions simmered beneath the surface over trade policies and military cooperation. Ties with the United Kingdom, France, and Portugal were particularly strained due to disputes over Hong Kong, Macau, and various colonial possessions in Asia. None of these relationships were as hostile, however, as the Republic's outright antagonistic stance toward the Soviet Union. When a series of border clashes erupted along the Sino-Soviet frontier in the mid-1960s, the balance of power in Asia once again stood precariously on a knife's edge. The world watched nervously as two nuclear powers faced off across the vast expanses of Central Asia, each convinced that the other represented an existential threat to their way of life. But that, my friends, is where our first installment ends. We've taken you through the dramatic what-if scenario where the Chinese nationalists managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, fundamentally altering the course of Asian and world history. In our next episode, we'll explore how this alternative China developed economically and socially, how it navigated the treacherous waters of Cold War geopolitics, and what impact a nationalist victory would have had on conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. We'll also examine the internal contradictions within this alternative Chinese republic, how a government that won power through military might struggle to transform itself into a genuine democracy, and how the promises of reform and modernization played out in practice. The story of what might have been in China is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning to get properly interesting. So, make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and join us next time as we continue exploring one of history's most fascinating alternative Until then, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never forget that history isn't just what happened, it's also what could have happened if only the dice had rolled differently. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!